For 3 straight days, the Senate Republican leader has come to the floor and has given us a history of presidential nominations to the Supreme Court. But clearly, an investigation is necessary. There must have been a hacking into his computer because he can't print the name Merrick Garland to include in the speech. The senator from Kentucky, the Republican leader, has failed to mention that name because that name is the reason we are in this spot today. When Justice Antonin Scalia passed away, President Obama exercised his constitutional responsibility to send a nominee to the Senate to fill the vacancy on the Supreme Court. And for the first time in the history of the Senate, for the first time ever, this Republican-led Senate refused to give this nominee a hearing and a vote. It had never, underline the word never, happened before. Was the reason that he was unqualified? Of course not. He's unanimously well qualified, serving on the D.C. Circuit Court. The reason was stated clearly by Senator McConnell. We're going to place a bet that the next president will be a Republican and let them fill this vacancy. So when the Republicans come to the floor as they have this morning, talking about the politicization of this process, the reason we are here, when we should be celebrating the 1-year anniversary of Merrick Garland on the Supreme Court, is because they kept that position vacant so it could be filled by a Republican president. That's exactly why we are here today. And this notion that it's somehow fanciful, that the choice of Neil Gorsuch was made by outside groups, is belied by the very words of the president himself, who thanked the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation, 2 special interest Republican organizations, for giving him a list of nominees for the Supreme Court. It was very open and public, and there was gratitude, political gratitude, that they came up with the name Neil Gorsuch. And that's a fact. And when you look at the history that's led us to this moment, the senator from Kentucky, the Republican leader, has to accept what is clear. In the history of the United States of America, until Senator McConnell's days under President Obama, exactly 68 nominees had been stopped by filibuster. Under Senator McConnell and the Republicans, 79 nominees of President Obama were stopped. It was an abuse of the filibuster never seen before in the history of our nation. And it was that abuse of the filibuster and statements that they would leave vacancies on critical courts like the D.C. Court of Appeals there forever and ever, amen, that led to the decision 4 years ago to say that we would employ a change in the rules so we could finally fill these court positions, finally break the filibuster death grip, which Senator McConnell had brought to this chamber in a way never before seen in history. So the senator from Kentucky has made history. He comes to the floor every day and tells us history. He made history in the number of filibusters that he used on this floor. He made history in denying a presidential nominee the opportunity for a hearing and a vote, which had never happened before in the history of the United States. Talk about partisanship. And when it comes to this Judge Gorsuch, I read his cases. I sat through the hearings. I was in the Senate Judiciary Committee. We took a measure of the man. He was careful to avoid any question that he could when it came to his position on cases and issues and values. That's not unusual. Supreme Court nominees do that. And so we tried to look at his cases. What do his cases that he decided reveal about the man? And 2 or 3 cases came right to the front. The first involved the sad story of a frozen truck driver on Interstate 88 outside of Chicago in January a few years back. 14 degrees below zero, the brakes on his trailer freeze, he pulls to the side of the road, calls his dispatcher and said, "Stay with the truck, we're sending somebody." Hours pass. He's now going through hypothermia. He's freezing, and he calls the dispatcher and says, "I've got to do something." He said, "You either drag this truck, disabled truck, out on the interstate and take your best chances, or you stick with the truck." He decided to unhitch the trailer, drive to a gas station, gas up, warm up, and come back. For that, he was fired. 7 judges looked at that case to decide whether it was fair to fire Alphonse Madden. 6 of the judges said no, he did the right thing. 1 judge said, "I rule for the trucking company that fired him," Neil Gorsuch. the nominee for the Supreme Court. Hobby Lobby case, the decision was basic. Who should decide the health care of thousands of workers? Well, the Green family that owns Hobby Lobby said our religious beliefs should dominate. We should decide family planning and birth control for our employees and their health insurance. Judge Gorsuch said that's right, because they own a corporation, and a corporation is a person. And as a corporation, they can have sincere religious beliefs. A choice between a corporate ownership of a family and 13,000 employees and their own personal religious rights, Judge Gorsuch rules for the corporation. Kansas State University. Kansas State University professor, after working there for many years, is diagnosed with cancer and has to go through bone marrow transplant, takes 6 months off, and then when she's called back to work, she calls the university and says, I understand that the influenza epidemic on campus, and I'm afraid, having just had bone marrow transplant, to be exposed to influenza at this point. They said, you either come back and teach or you're fired. She didn't come back, they fired her. And it was Judge Gorsuch who said their employer was right. Kansas State University was right. Those are insights into the value of a man who wants a lifetime appointment to the United States Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. And the questions we have raised about his judgment and his values go to the heart of who we are and what we want to be. Do we want the Supreme Court to continue to be a voice for the corporations and corporate elite and employers? Do we want to exclude the opportunities of common people like that truck driver, Al Madden, to have his day in court and be treated fairly? That's what it comes down to. It's a fundamental question of fairness and justice. I'm sorry, because I love the Senate, and I've spent a good part of my life here, that we've reached this moment. But this effort to fill the courts of this nation with Republican appointments, even at the expense of violating Senate traditions that are over 100 years old, that has brought us to this moment. As someone said, the nuclear option was used by Senator McConnell when he stopped Merrick Garland. What we're facing today is the fallout. Mr. President, I yield the floor.